Here we go. Well, welcome into our Zoom video with newsmakers from the world of sports, presented by Pressbox. I'm Stan the Fan. Gary Stein is on screen with me, and our guest is the esteemed, retired columnist of the Baltimore Sun, Peter Schmuck. And Peter, there was some confusion at the very end there, wasn't there? I read the Lasorda piece where he called you out at the winter meeting. Look at that stupid guy for moving from LA to Baltimore. And I thought that was your last column. Was that your last column, or was the Willie Mays piece the last column?
No, that was my last column, Stan. That ran on Sunday, I want to say May 10th.
Yep.
And the Willie Mays column ran the previous Wednesday.
Okay. All right.
So
I
they
got
were
that straight.
They were sort of both, in a way, farewell columns. I knew what was going down. And so I wrote the Willie Mays column because it was his birthday, and I wasn't making that up. I totally idolized him as a young kid, and it just made for an easy kind of nostalgic column. And it wasn't obvious from the column that I was stepping away, but to me it was, because it was just a nice thing to be able to do as the second to the last column for the Baltimore Sun. But now, that Sunday column was the one.
Okay. Now, before Gary gets to dig in and ask you a couple of hard-hitting questions.
Oh, yeah.
At McDonald's, they show how many billion hamburgers they've sold. Do we know how many columns you wrote for the Baltimore Sun? Did you keep track of that?
No, I did not. I could tell you could probably just start out at 2004 and multiply 16 by
12.
16 years. Well, 16
Okay.
years by probably 150 a year. So
Okay.
you're talking about, that's a lot.
That's a chunk.
Couple thousand.
That's a chunk of work. Aaron, I know you
A couple
got
of them were actually pretty good too.
a lot of them were very good, Peter. A lot of
So
them.
Peter, I just want to let you know, I never do this, okay? But in honor of you, I'm going to take a little step back. My Orioles jersey today is because you, and Stan pointed out very properly that you didn't only write about the Orioles, you wrote about all of Maryland sports, which is true. But I associate you more with the Orioles, and I think most people probably do at this point. But let
me just interrupt for 1 second, Gary. You are correct, though. What drew Peter here was, and tell me if I'm wrong, Peter, was you were the national baseball writer for the Baltimore Sun when you first came to Baltimore. Was that correct?
No, I was the Oriole beat writer when I came to the Baltimore Sun for the first 4 years, or 4+ years. And then that strike year in '94, they decided to make me the national baseball writer so that I could cover that full time, and it turned out to be a full-time job for the next almost 2 years. And then I stayed on as a national baseball writer until 2004, and then they promoted me to columnist in 2004. But I left the Orange County Register. I had been 11 years as the Angels and Dodgers beat writer, and this was an opportunity. I think the reason I came from California to here was the reputation of the Baltimore Sun as a truly national type newspaper, international type newspaper. They had foreign bureaus all over the world, and also they had this wonderful history. I was very much aware of H.L. Mencken and the Scopes Monkey trial. I am a bit of a history buff. And so it was appealing when they contacted me. I was at a point at the Orange County Register where I was just ready to do something else. And it was not an easy decision to move all the way to the East Coast. It wasn't an easy decision at all. And I had some interest from a couple other papers that time. That was when the National Sports Daily was taking people away from a whole bunch of papers. So a lot of jobs opened up in 1989, late '89. I talked to Newsday. I had some contact with the National Sports Daily, and kind of felt like I wasn't in a position to. They never offered me anything, but I wasn't in a position to risk my long-term future there. I just had little kids at the time. I had Laurel was 1 year old, and Daniel was 5. So I was going to have to be a solid career, even lifetime position for me to move out of Southern California. And the Baltimore Sun offered that, and it just had a nice ring to it at the time. And it was a tough first couple of years. Number one, I'd be honest with you guys. I know the romance of Memorial Stadium for someone who grew up here. I had no romance from Memorial Stadium.
Yeah.
I had grown up in Anaheim Stadium, which was new stadium when I was a kid, and then Dodger Stadium when I covered the Dodgers is a classic stadium. I didn't care that much for Memorial Stadium, so I showed up as they were breaking ground for Oriole Park at Camden Yards, and I was looking very much forward to that. But the first year or two wasn't easy. It was not an easy adjustment, but people made me feel real welcome here. I will say this, I'm not doing this just because I'm looking him straight in the eye on this Zoom, but Stan Charles really made me feel welcome here. He was the first person who really befriended me, and I don't know if you remember it that way, Stan, but first person who really befriended me here outside of the newspaper.
I just wanted to screw Jeff Rimmer out of using you for free.
And you did. First person to put me on the radio and pay me, which was very nice. And so, but the adjustment was difficult for a year or so. It was a much harder job than I had in California. The Orioles were the only team here, and it was a big deal. We rode every day. We rode every day in the winter. I remember the first off season after I showed up here. Didn't realize I'd always gotten the off season pretty much off in California. I'd work the whole season. I'd take very little time off during the season, and then I kind of, other than the winter meetings and making sure I was on a couple of trades or moves, I was pretty much off. I came here, they needed something in the paper every day on the Orioles. So that was really an adjustment because you really had to really work it. You had to be on the phone. Fortunately, the Orioles were very cooperative. In those days, they'd give you a home phone list for the whole team.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't like it, they'd tell them that's part of your job, answer his calls. And I had a couple of situations like that. I remember a Randy Milligan, wonderful guy, but his wife, for some reason, didn't like him being called at home by media. And she would bark at me and say, I don't want you calling. and I would say, I'm sorry, but Randy's on the team and I need to talk to him. So put him on the phone and we'd spar a little bit. And Randy was so wonderful. You remember Randy, a wonderful guy. And we got past that. But you had to have those phone numbers because you were calling somebody every day to say, hey, what's going on with you? Did you have a nice trip to Europe? Did you do this? Did you do that? I got used to it after a year or two, and then we moved into Camden Yards, and that was such a joy. It was so much closer to home. I had made the mistake of moving into Arnold, Maryland, and it's a long hike to Memorial Stadium from there. And then I moved closer. I moved up to Millersville. The team moved down closer to me, and then I had a 19-minute commute. Fabulous, Camden Yards, still fabulous. Hope to be there a lot still, even though I'm not going to be a regular baseball writer there. It's all worked out great. And I was not lying. I had two really, really good opportunities to leave Baltimore after that in 97 and 2007, both for huge raises. And the family had become so comfortable here. One time the money was just too good to walk away from, but the family said, we like it here. We want to be here. And so, and after that, it was never a question after that. And we're here. We're not going anywhere.
Hey, Peter, and that was kind of trumps right into my question to you, which is, coming from Los Angeles to Baltimore, I mean, you can't have much more of a culture shock than that. You've got the ritz and glitz of LA against the grit and determination, I guess, of Baltimore. I actually went through the same thing because I'm originally from Miami Beach, Florida, and moved here to Baltimore, same kind of transition. But my question is, what did you expect Baltimore to be actually as a sports town? How would you compare Baltimore as a sports town to LA as a sports town?
Well, I'll say this. I knew enough about Baltimore. I had come here, for the previous 11 years. I only covered the National League for 3 of those. So I was coming to Baltimore twice a year. And my very first road trip as a baseball writer was to Baltimore in 1979. That was in late August. Remember it well. We stayed at the Cross Keys Inn. Seemed like we were out in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
Got our late night snacks at Shane's down the street on Falls Road. not there anymore, as Bill Stetko would say.
That used
so
to be
I was-
Harley. That used to be Harleys back in the 50s. James.
Yep.
Go ahead.
And so I, it was not, it was a weird kind of thing for the first few years. We would go to the Cross Keys, generally did not go into town. We're basically told, don't go into town. And I can tell you what, Baltimore is a lot safer then than it is now. Eventually we kind of gravitated into town, and the Inner Harbor was rising. But to answer your question, the culture shock part of it wasn't as much as you might have thought, because number one, I moved to Arnold, Maryland. I moved into the suburbs. I didn't really live in Los Angeles. I lived in Orange County, and I lived in various places in Orange County, which is a suburban area. It's got big cities, but it's largely a suburban area. And my final stop was Seal Beach, which was a nice little beach community. We dreamed of living near the beach. We basically got out over our skis there. It was an expensive place to live, and the Orange County Register is not a high-paying establishment. But we made it work, and that was the adjustment, was just going from this beach community that we kind of dreamed of living in to kind of going back to what we lived in before, which was a nice suburbs. I live in the Severna Park, Millersville area right now. It's not that much different. I mean, the terrain's obviously different. I live in a house that has a forest in the backyard, and that you don't find in California. It's Southern California. It's high desert. You can be more likely to have a cactus in your backyard, or an orange tree, as we did when we were kids. It was that part of it. People were so nice. We moved into a neighborhood, had lots of kids, immediately felt comfortable as far as living, until August came around, and we didn't have central air conditioning at the time. We found out that's kind of important. It's kind of important here. Those room air conditioners in August,
that's not going to cut it.
They don't really make it.
Gary, go ahead.
Yeah. So Peter, moving on from that, you certainly covered a lot of great sporting events when you're here or while you were here, and we're going to talk about those. But I just want to talk about the newspaper connection to sports and the sports fan. I'm sure that when you grew up, as Stan and I did as well, you couldn't wait till the morning paper came. You had everything a young kid wanted in sports was in that paper. All the box scores, all the game stories, not only your own local, right, but everything. And you had it right there. And I guess my thing is, and maybe we're all fuddy-duddies or maybe not, I don't know, but you held a newspaper. You waited for it, you opened the door, and you held it for as long as you were reading it. To me, it's different when you go online and you look at something. You actually have to actively search it out. So my question to you is, do you see moving forward, and maybe even now, a different connection between young people and sports today as opposed to when we were kids? And does the newspaper have something to do with that?
Well, I don't know if the newspaper specifically has something to do with that. It's simply progress. The newspaper is yesterday's form of communication for the most part when it's printed, though newspapers still make money in print. They still do. And maybe not this last few weeks, but normally they still do. I think it's more where the world has gone. I don't think kids have any problem reading about sports on the internet. They read it differently. They view sports differently because TV is much more expanded now in this past couple of decades than when we were kids. And we got a game of the week, or if the Dodgers played the Giants on the road, we got that game at night on TV and looked forward to every one of them. I think that because it was more limited, like any situation where there's less supply and more demand, I think we have a romance for those games because they weren't every single day.
Absolutely.
You can watch, even without special channels, you probably can watch 3 to 4 games a day at home, even without the ticket, or whatever they call it. And so I think that the vast availability of video changes the way kids look at it. It's not something as special to them. It's just what they live. That's the world they live in. And then you add the extra layer of these high-tech games that kids have gotten involved in, where they can actually play baseball on the internet, and the graphics are so wonderful. We had video games when we were kids, or when we were teenagers, when they really kind of came out with Pong, but they were so primitive. We had fun with them. You used them to pass some time waiting to get into a restaurant. You'd sit in the lobby of the restaurant, play Pong or Space Invaders or something. But what they have now is just another world entirely. And I don't know if I envy them. I don't, I have people my age who still play those games. They enjoy those games. I can't spend that time doing that. Occasionally I'll sit down with one of the grandkids or something and goof around a little bit. But they just have so many options. I want to go back to your previous question, Gary, because I never got around to LA and the sports community. And this kind of ties in a weird kind of way, in that one of the reasons why the Rams could leave town and we didn't all stand on the curb and cry like they did here when the Colts left is because there were 9 other professional teams within 90 miles of Dodger Stadium, or 100 miles, if we want to be exact. There were at least 9 other professional teams. They also had USC and UCLA, which were bigger than the Rams in the community. And a variety of next tier colleges all up and down the coast. And so, and you had and you even had access to the Bay Area if you really wanted it, if you really wanted to spend a weekend. So California was just different, and the sports were just different. And people and a lot of people say, well, also you had the beach in the summer, and that's some truth to that too. There's, we can go to Ocean City for a week here, but it's a 2.5-hour drive for some people, or a 3-hour drive. Southern California has 300 miles of beaches. If you live in Southern California, you're in the areas where people actually live in Southern California, everybody's an hour from the beach. So there's so much, and plus they had every other thing. You could boat, you could hike, you could do all the other things too. You can ski. And so it's just what California is. You can do anything you want there. There is an appeal to that. And that has drawn people since the Rose Bowl Parade got on TV. It drew people during the Dust Bowl in the 30s. And now it's drawn too many people. And that's one of the reasons I was happy to leave. I didn't want to sit in traffic anymore. And when I go back, I once went to interview for a job back in 2007, I think. Job offer I got from Yahoo in Santa Monica, which is supposed to be a great place, and it is. And I finished 2 days of interviews and was going to meet my wife in Los Angeles, somewhere in town, she's waiting for me to finish the interviews. Got stuck on the Santa Monica freeway for about 3 hours, not moving. And by the time I got moving in the car, I said, no, we're not doing this. I'm not doing this again. I've done this before. I'm not doing it anymore. Of course, we have traffic sometimes here, but it's not the same.
We're talking with Peter Schmuck, the recently retired columnist of the Baltimore Sun. But Peter, you're far from retired. Now, I do want to get into some events that you covered, but tell folks when you can be listened to on WBAL radio.
Yeah, I still have my Saturday show, which is not sports. It's current events, and right now it's just COVID. COVID-19 has blotted out the sun here all over the world, and so lately that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the reopening, and that's Saturday mornings 10 to 12. It's 11 to 2.
11 to 2.
Show 11 to 2 on Saturdays, and I'll be turning up on WBAL and some other things. I've always had a history of filling in there for vacationing people to make a little extra money. I am semi-retired. I do have WBAL because I like doing it.
Yeah.
I couldn't make a living doing that.
Yes, you could. Yes, you could.
Fortunately, I don't have to. But I'll be there, and I'll turn up writing stuff sometime. I'm just not ready to do it. I just want to kind of decompress and not be under pressure to write on a daily type stuff for at least a few months, just to see what it feels like, and then poke around for some freelance stuff, or maybe create a project for myself, maybe try to write a book or something. I just don't know. I've never done, I've written a small kids book. I've never written a book, so I really don't know if I'm built that way. But all those things are open to me, and that's fun to think about all these things that I
Let's
can
discuss
try.
a couple of all right. Let's discuss a few of the events you covered, Peter. From 1992 through 1996, you got to cover the opening of Camden Yards, Cal Ripken tying and breaking Lou Gehrig's record, and the return of pro football here. Could you talk about those three events briefly?
Sure, and you left out Eddie Murray's 500th home run at midnight,
Yep.
and the '96 Olympics, where poor Richard Jewell had his life ruined after the bombing in Olympic Park, in Centennial Park. That was an amazing thing, and a reason why I was glad I'd come to Baltimore, because I wouldn't have necessarily been in the position to do some of those things had I been the national baseball writer for the Orange County Register at that point, which was something that had been in play but didn't happen. Then I probably would have been there for the Cal Ripken game.
Right.
You know, that was a national story.
And they played and they were playing the Angels.
Right.
So it would have been, yeah.
Right, absolutely, and so, but yeah, it was pretty amazing. The thing you left out that really meant something to me and affected the way I would go forward in my life here was actually
Cuba?
the last game at Memorial Stadium.
Okay.
That was unbelievably emotional. I didn't have the history with those people, with those players. Maybe a little bit with. You know, Brooks Robinson would come to Anaheim. I got his autograph when I was a kid. I always tell him that. He gets mad when I tell him that. Yeah, that told me so much. I mean, you know, at one level, if you're a cynical Californian, you'd say, what are these people crying about this stuff for? It's just baseball.
Right.
Because that's what you feel like in California. And they love the Dodgers in California. And they loved all the way back to 50, you know, even though they're relatively new, 57 or 58 when they came here. But they love Duke Snyder. They love Sandy Koufax. They had their heroes, just like, you know, they still revere Sandy Koufax very much like we revere Brooks here. And so, but the level of emotion that was attached to the team, and that was probably magnified by the fact that the Colts had left, and it was still, that pain was still pretty fresh. It's only 7-8 years before. It just told me something about these fans, and they never disappoint. I mean, and that goes through, when I talk about fans of the teams, but the fans of the teams read the paper. They read about the Orioles. They respond. They're happy sometimes. They're mad at you sometimes, but it's always pretty darn sincere. And
how about a couple of those other events, though? The opening of the ballpark and the Ripken and the return of football.
Well, you know, opening the ballpark was very exciting for everybody. You were there. Everybody was there from back then. And it was such a wonderful revelation. This ballpark, it's old, it's new, it's perfectly beautiful, and it's lasting forever because it doesn't look a day older today than it was then. Brilliant design by Janet Marie Smith and Larry Lucchino's input. And so that was just exciting, the newness of it. And the way that all came down, bringing in Rick Sutcliffe to pitch the game, the way opening day went, it was just so perfect. And that's what I remember about it. It was so perfect. And also realizing when you arrived there that day that I had this 19-minute commute, and it was so easy. You know, they really designed everything about it great. The traffic patterns, everything about the stadium is so much easier than other stadiums around the country. So it's just an unbelievable thing. Then you get to Cal's 2131. There's so many things that led up to that. We could talk for hours. You know, John Eisenberg wrote a whole book about everything about it, the streak. But that day, you know, to be in that stadium and look up and see Joe DiMaggio on the verge of tears and Cal Ripken Sr. crying, and Cal clearly has overcome with emotions. The victory lap, everything about it, again, perfect. The theater of it was perfect, and it was spontaneous, and the theater of it was perfect. It wasn't, you know, none of it was really that was pre-planned, other than, you know, the speeches afterwards. What was the third thing you were?
The return of pro football.
You know, that was an interesting time because I was not very much involved in that. You know, we were so obsessed with the Orioles at that point.
Yeah.
They were selling out every game. You had 5 seats there. You knew you were in the middle of that. That lower bowl was a who's who of Baltimore every single night. It was our version of Hollywood at a baseball game, where you had Boogie or you had
Steve Miles.
People, everybody. I mean, it was just everybody who was anybody was in that field level or in the club level. And the more important people were all around them, the fans that are there every single day, and so that part of it really was really exciting for me. But I wasn't really that involved with the Ravens, the draft. In those days, I didn't go help cover the draft like I have the last 20 years. I didn't start really going to the games until the early 2000s, where I go every Sunday, because I was a columnist. But I knew what it meant, because I had already been here long enough to know what everybody had gone through in 1984, and in between. The attempt to bring in the Boogie's attempt to bring a team here,
an expansion team
getting overlooked. Tagliabue saying we should build a museum. We all knew we already had a lot of museums, and so and then the way it went down, with the Browns coming here, which had to make fans have a little bit of mixed feelings. They want this team so badly, and at the same time, the same thing is now happening to Cleveland that happened to Baltimore, because that's the way professional sports is. It's funny how those two particular moves stand out. But what, a dozen teams, 20 teams have moved since then that never had that kind of any reaction that equaled the Browns leaving Cleveland or the Colts leaving Baltimore, because of those two cities and what they were, and how the history of the two cities, and the limited, the limited population was making these kind of cities settle for only a couple of sports, and we lost the one that was most popular.
Gary, time for a couple more from you.
Peter, one of the common themes among all those highlights that you just talked about, it's so interesting. It has to do with fans. You talked about the emotion on opening day at Camden Yards. You talked about anybody, as my cat walked past, everybody that was anybody was there. Football coming to town, how emotional that was, how emotional we were when the Colts left in '84. Everything that you talked about has to do with fans being present. There are not going to be any fans of baseball this year, at least in the foreseeable future. There were no fans at the 2015 game that you covered when the Orioles played the White Sox because of the Freddie Gray situation. Simple question. Is baseball doing itself a service or a disservice by coming back without fans? How do you feel about it?
My opinion is that they're doing a disservice. I don't think it's going to work the way they want, other than getting $800 million in TV money if they can get through to the playoffs. I just think, and I'll go along with Buck Showalter, who I did a column with him talking specifically about this, reflecting on the 5th anniversary of Freddie Gray, the Freddie Gray no fan game. And, we already are at an era where you've seen attendance since the Freddie Gray incident, attendance drop every single year at Camden Yards. Now, if this season had started on time, there was a chance they wouldn't have drawn 1 million this year. And that's not because we don't have good fans. That's because of a lot of circumstances. And one of those circumstances is that we've already, because of technology, made it pretty easy not to come to the ballpark. Mm-hmm. We've got 70-inch TVs now you can buy at Costco for $560. I'm serious. And that's a better view than you're going to get from any seat at Camden Yards. And so the fan experience has been damaged to some extent, but that doesn't keep them from filling Fenway Park. So as Buck pointed out, you just don't want to give fans any more excuses not to come. And I think what this is going to show, it may show the opposite. We don't know yet. When you start putting these games on TV with no fans, I don't know, maybe people will realize, hey, you really need fans for these games to be entertaining. And he pointed that out too, saying, you know, when you watch a game on TV, the fan reaction still impacts your enjoyment of the game on TV.
Absolutely.
And so I worry about what you're going to get. I think that people have reached the point this year where we kind of know what we're going to get is half a loaf, and not a very good half a loaf. And maybe we just wait around and have a huge, huge opening next year, next spring, and treat it like Super Bowl, do something that makes the beginning of it a tremendous festival, provided we have a vaccine and everybody's comfortable, but I think we will by then. And just start building up to that. But baseball is saying that, you know, operationally, they're going to lose $3 or $4 billion across the board. And so I kind of understand that they feel like they have to do this, but I do think that it could do long-term damage to the fan base of the sport. We'll see. I mean, it's a wonderfully resilient game, as we've proven through many scandals and many labor disputes. So maybe it'll just bounce back and it'll all be just fine.
Hope so.
Gary, let me close things out. I think we'd be remiss, and we can't touch on everything you covered, but Peter, you had a pretty unique relationship with somebody who is kind of faded from the landscape, and that's Peter Angelos.
Yep.
What do you think will be the enduring legacy of Peter Angelos, the sportsman?
Well, it'll be mixed because he was such a lightning rod. I think it's interesting how he kind of remade himself after he stood up against the replacement player strategy and alienated all the owners. But then when it came time to move the Nats here, he still had enough juice to get that tremendously beneficial Masson deal, which of course has now become a matter of dispute for a number of years and maybe will be for another year or two. But I think that people will remember him a couple of ways as the, you know, fist pounding hardball owner who you know, who would not do some things during that 14-year stretch of losing that the fans wanted him to do, and caused him to be vilified quite a bit in the media and by the fans. But then to hand this situation over to Andy MacPhail and actually step back some, and then Dan Duquette and Buck, and have this renaissance. I think that as we go forward, I think more people are going to remember this past decade than those 14 years. I think people would just as soon forget that 14-year losing streak. But we have to say he was a controversial character. The reaction to him will always be mixed. But he did keep the Orioles under local ownership at a time when people were still a little you know, insecure in the aftermath of the Colts leaving. So I think he'll be remembered as a net positive for the city. I don't think there's any question about that. But he was not his own best PR. He is not his own best PR man. And I wish him the best. I know he's in bad health. We know we haven't seen him.
Yep.
He's 90 years old or thereabouts coming up. But again, quite a giant figure for a man who didn't stand that tall physically. A giant figure in sports history here in Baltimore.
Very well put. And Gary, I appreciate your participation as always on these midweek Zoom videos. Peter, we appreciate you coming on. You've been a great writer and a great friend, and I know both will continue. But BAL from 11 a.m. till 2 p.m. on Saturdays, you can listen to Peter Schmuck. For all of us at Zoom, we'll say goodbye right now. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.